I want to say, Jim, sometimes it takes getting to that point where you're just done with the practitioners and that whole roller coaster of kind of giving your power away. Chris, I can relate to so much of your story, even though my symptoms were fairly different. So my recovery came from hearing somebody else's story. I had an absolute light bulb moment when I heard someone else's recovery story. So I really invite you tonight to open to that possibility that you can recover, and it can happen now. You don't have to continue to go to doctor after doctor. It really is possible. So one thing, as I talk about my symptoms, I would also suggest you think, what was happening emotionally and psychologically in my life at the time my symptoms started, because like Chris said, we're so trained to think physically. How did I move? What did I eat? But really the root of this is typically emotional and psychological. So for me, the onset of chronic fatigue syndrome came after a big T trauma. It was a really traumatic event. It was an assault that happened to me when I was abroad, and I didn't really know anybody in the country. After that point, I got these 3 colds and my system completely crashed. I really felt like I had the flu 24/7. This actually went on for almost a decade. So at the time that the symptoms began, I was an active TV news reporter. I was working 50 to 60 hours a week. I was traveling the world. And then I went to this place where I literally could not leave the house. It took months to be able to gain the strength just to almost like relearn how to walk around the block. And I was just so weak. I couldn't sleep at all. Everything burned, like my brain, my limbs. I wasn't digesting food. Just so many brain fog. I couldn't remember the name of even a close friend. So my life became really small, and I had to leave my career as a broadcast journalist. I could no longer support myself. And now in retrospect, I see how those stresses actually made the condition worse, even though at the time I really wasn't linking them. So kind of like Chris, I was focused on the physical cause. I actually think the event was so traumatic, I blacked it out to some extent. And all the doctors I went to, even integrative doctors, were just focused on labs. And what they kept coming up with was you have these very high titers of Epstein-Barr and all these viruses like mycoplasma. And I remember one doctor saying, it's actually crossed the blood-brain barrier and your brain is riddled with viruses and you will literally never be the same. And they said you'll never have children. I mean, so many things. So all these words, even beyond the diagnosis, were so depressing in and of themselves that I would just kind of spiral down. And what I also realize now is they were just so scary, so that activates the danger signal in the brain. And of course, the symptoms just kept getting worse. So things kind of went on like that, with the diagnosis being chronic fatigue syndrome, sometimes fibromyalgia, as well as adrenal exhaustion and a bunch of other things. I tried, vitamin IVs. I actually even tried antiviral IVs, which completely crashed my system. I couldn't get out of bed for months after that. I tried all kinds of stuff like acupuncture, energy work, so many restrictive diets, taking 30 supplements a day, which I'm sure a lot of you know is stressful in and of itself. And all the while, I did start getting some therapy, some psychotherapy, and even some trauma therapy. But I think really what the missing link was connecting the trauma and the repressed emotions from that with the physical symptoms. They were actually the same thing, but even going to some good therapists, it didn't move the needle at all in how I was feeling physically. And, I got to this point where it was so exasperating, as Jim was just talking about, being on this roller coaster. I saw over 50 practitioners over the course of a decade, that I think after about 9 years, I finally just said, I give up. Not so much giving up on my health, but I'm just not even going to focus on that anymore. And I had started meditating a number of years before, and I was doing gentle yoga every day. And I just started focusing on what I enjoyed. At this point, I was on disability, so I couldn't work. But I would just be in nature. I started writing poetry. And all these things were actually really pivotal because they put me in this place where I was kind of accepting of my situation, not giving up, but I just was more peaceful. I wasn't really fighting it. And then interestingly, even though I had actually read a Sarno book years before and it resonated, I didn't know how it applied to me and the chronic fatigue. But through one of these, I was taking an online poetry class. And I happened to meet a woman and she said, oh, well, I had a really severe case of chronic fatigue syndrome and I healed through this mind-body work. So we set up a conversation, and I remember this was in the winter of 2018, and I had such severe migraine headache, flu-like symptoms, dizziness, because these symptoms would kind of come and go over the years, but mostly come. And I said, I can probably just talk for a few minutes. 3 hours later, I had this, what I would say is a spontaneous remission. I literally started running around the block. I left my bed, I started running around the block. I felt absolutely on top of the world. So what happened in those 3 hours was this woman really listened to my story. And she also explained how it was very similar to her story. All the same symptoms, different stress, but stress or trauma is stress or trauma. And at the end of this phone call, she went out on a limb and she said, and she's not a doctor, she's not any kind of therapist. She said, Rebecca, you are not sick. She said, you're not sick. It's repressed emotions. Your brain is sort of stuck on these old neural pathways. It's like a broken record. And you just have this unresolved trauma. And then the light bulb went out, and somehow my brain 100% believed it. Because I just saw it made so much sense. Nothing else had been working. So the only thing that changed in that conversation was my mind. And I went to jogging around the block. I started this 30-day yoga challenge the next day, like more of a power yoga, before I was just kind of laying on the ground and stretching. And then really though, within the next week, some symptoms came back, which is really typical and it can happen with TMS, not always, but remember you have all those neural pathways that are now kind of highly sensitized to sensations and to triggers in your environment. And as Sarno would explain, your brain's trying to protect you from feeling emotions. So I needed to work with it more deeply, and I started seeing this wonderful mind-body coach, Jim Prusak, who's on the line, and worked with him for probably 9 or 10 months, first every week and then every other week. And that was just a whole process of learning a whole new way of thinking and feeling. And over that year, I basically, fully recovered. I started traveling again. I started working actually as a mind-body coach, and I went back to it, writing, but a different kind of writing. And so what I want to just sort of sum up that really helped me, that I think applies to whatever symptoms you have, the ones Chris talked about, or any other kind of pain, irritable bowel syndrome. I had interstitial cystitis, that's also a mind-body thing, is really this self-soothing talk, that you find language that calms down your system. And a lot of times that comes through this knowledge of knowing that even if you have bulging discs, you're not injured, and that's actually not what's causing the pain. So in my case, it's just constantly reinforcing, I am not sick, I'm safe, I'm okay. This is just my brain creating these symptoms, and this will pass. I'm strong, I'm resilient. So as the symptoms would come up, I would just repeat that over and over. Now, they did come up again because Jim was working with me to expand my range of activities. And that's a really important part of TMS as well, is you want to really take charge of your life and start going back to the things you enjoy. Well, of course, that's terrifying, right? Because they cause the pain, supposedly. And they do in a sense, because you have this learned association with that activity. So I started taking baby steps to do more activities, and symptoms would come, like insomnia would come and flu-like symptoms would come. But I would just keep reinforcing, I'm just retraining myself. It's not going to be like this forever. I'm safe. These can't harm me. And then I kept taking baby steps, and eventually your brain realizes, oh, she's doing these activities and she seems to be okay. And when the symptoms come, it's really shifting your relationship to them so you're not scared of them. Because as you turn down that danger signal, the symptoms will subside too. It's really like the fear that activates your nervous system. So the other thing was learning to really feel the physical sensations in the body. So often we're just conceptualizing things, but instead of just saying, I have pain, you know, Jim worked with me in meditations, and I continue to do them really every day on my own, is just tracking sensations in the body. So is it pulsing? Is it warm? Is it throbbing? Is it burning? What are the qualities? And then tuning into that and really tracking it and staying with it. And a lot of times what you'll find is it'll shift. You're not trying to make it shift though. You're not trying to get rid of it. In my case, I started feeling a lot of emotion. And so I really needed to go into that emotion and really process the trauma. But I didn't have to go back to another trauma therapist. It's just these techniques I was doing with Jim and I started doing on my own. Of just feeling the sensations, because you're really then with that raw energy of the emotion. And you're retraining your mind that those sensations are not unsafe. So just kind of in closing, I want to say that it can take dedication. Some people have a spontaneous recovery, and why not that be you? But if that doesn't happen, as we were talking at the beginning, like, don't give up. This can really take months or in my case, a year to really retool my system. But what you'll find is it's so satisfying. It's this whole new way of living in a way that you're more in touch with your body, your intuition, your emotions. I think it's a much fuller life, and it's a much more empowering way to live. And also just focus on the things that you can control right now. So you may not be able to will away the symptoms right now, and that can kind of stress us out. But if we just reach for, what do I enjoy? Where can I find some enjoyment? Kind of turning my attention to things I enjoy, finding some mental and emotional relief, that can really go a long way. And also finally, just not really judging yourself if your progress isn't what you wanted, because this really does work. It just, it can in some cases take some commitment. So I just say, if you're on this call, there's a reason for it. You probably have a mind-body issue or know someone that does. Otherwise you wouldn't show up. So I encourage you to just, keep exposing yourself to it and keep practicing the techniques.
Wow.